Welcome, everyone, to the Addiction, Cancer, Recovery, and Me podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the different types of addiction, as well as the impact on society writ large, and we'll go more specifically in depth on Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, and other forms of rehabilitation. The information provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. We are not medical professionals, although we have and will at times consult medical professionals. The content shared is based on our personal experience and research. This is Adrian's story from his perspective. So, Adrian, I think it's important for the purposes of addressing addiction with a broader stroke than just focusing on alcoholism.
Of course,
Obviously,
yeah.
there
Yeah,
are
absolutely,
various
yeah.
forms of addiction.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to, make sure that everybody understands that while this is your perspective and talking your story of dealing with alcohol addiction, that the lessons learned and the sort of journey through AA and rehab are actually very comparable and very similar for all forms of addiction in terms of, one, recognizing the signs and getting over the denial stage, which we've talked about separately. And then secondly, getting past that denial stage and admitting that one is an addict, whether it's alcoholic or a drug addict or a sugar addict, right? And that they all have an impact on the wiring of our brain, how we exhibit various signs of addiction, how it impacts our body physiologically, and therefore how it also impacts us and those around us mentally, right?
Yeah.
So within that framing, I would love to have a bit of a conversation and back and forth first about the various forms of addiction that we see in society. From your perspective, from my perspective, we'll all have familial ties, to various forms of addiction and witnessing it, experiencing it ourselves. So maybe let's just start there. What are the various types of addiction, and why is it important to recognize these various forms?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, the initial ones that spring to mind, I'm sure you probably put a little bit more meat on the bone. Of course, there's substance abuse. There's obviously dietary issues, food, etc., as well as
Drug addiction.
drug addiction. Yes, we talked about substance abuse.
Yes, right.
As well as dietary, as I just touched on. As well as also, the dietary side of things are probably the best if I elaborate on that a bit further. So
Sure, yeah.
When I say diet, it's not just about eating, but also about non-eating.
Right.
There's the bulimia side of things as well. And funny enough, it's not funny, but you know what I mean, in a roundabout way.
Interestingly enough.
Yeah, interestingly enough is a better choice of words. My first bout of rehab, in fact, both bouts of rehab, there was quite a mixture of different formats of addiction. There was gambling, another one which we obviously just didn't touch on there initially.
Yes.
There was obviously substance abuse wise, opiates are something that's also very misunderstood.
Yes. There's a huge crisis.
Obviously
currently.
heroin is an opiate, but painkillers,
Yes.
etc., fall underneath that umbrella. As well as I say, we touched on bulimia and
Mental health and
health addiction, as well as sugar. We talk about dietary. Sugar is up there with the opiates. It's renowned as
yes.
It's well documented that it's as powerful, maybe not physically, but certainly mentally, as like the opiates such as heroin, etc. So absolutely, it's definitely worth elaborating on that a bit and explaining that it's not just we're not just voicing our opinions.
Right.
I know that it's paramount that we cover. The objective here is to get across what has got me well and what keeps me well.
Right.
For both through addiction and through cancer. But yeah, as I say, there are, and as you rightly touched on, there are numerous other areas of addiction that we should be addressing, and there isn't, I think it's arguably fair to say that there's not one is any worse than the other. They all have different detrimental effects, but some are, most of it's very misunderstood. Addiction in itself is incredibly misunderstood. It's an actual illness. It's not It's not a habit. It's not something that we can just pick up and put down whenever we wish. We can certainly pick it up, but we can't put it down. You know, it's such a baffling thing. It's so misunderstood, and you know, and it's albeit there's a lot of, you know, science around it now. Obviously there's a lot of, dare I say it, more understanding of what, you know, creates the addict mind or the tendencies for someone to become an addict. But there's also still a lot that's very misunderstood, and you know, and it's demonized, and rightly so. But there's not a lot of sympathy around the addict way, because people, it's very frowned upon, and people often see it as a weakness.
Right.
But believe me, I know a lot of influential people, and there's, you know, as we know through you know, show business and media, and you know, people that are very, you know, people face, you know, that have a, you know, strong influences on the public. As you know, they are very.
They're some of they're some of the biggest addicts, right?
Absolutely, yeah, exactly. So
partly because of the environment, right? So that to perform, you know, some people who become famous, sometimes it's by luck the first time, and then to sort of maintain that fame and notoriety or level of success, as it's deemed, puts a lot of pressure on people. So then they feel they sort of succumb to the addiction because it just helps them maintain it. Because
and to get through the day,
to get through the day, especially now they have all this pressure on their shoulders to be this person that they didn't necessarily intend to become, right?
Playing a role.
Yeah, playing a role. So I think it's a really important part also because people, like you said, it's misunderstood or at least not fully understood, combination of both. Partly because we're only just starting to sort of uncover these studies of the impacts of food and substance on our bodies in the last sort of century or so. But we also, and also partly because of the shaming aspect of it, right? So it's kind of driven underground because people don't want to admit that they have an addiction or a problem, and so they don't address it, right?
Yeah.
So for all intents and purposes, I think it's really great to sort of talk about what that does to our bodies, just to clarify for the audience purposes. And while some addictions can be worse than others on the surface, they ultimately have very similar impacts on our body under the surface, right? Under the skin level surface. So just to reframe that, I think it's important to talk about, for example, sugar. You know, we don't often recognize that as an addiction, but it's having an impact on our children from a very young age. And so that's why I wanted to talk about it here with you, because we talk about addiction in adults quite often, but we don't talk about where it starts. And we have in another episode touched upon sort of how addiction starts and what are the root causes. But I think, you know, we talk about it often from a trauma-induced scenario, not an environment-induced scenario whereby our very diet is causing that addiction and rewiring of the brain. So just to quickly outline here some of the things that we've been reading together. One is these substances, including sugar, food and substances, create a dopamine response, right?
They do,
and that creates a wiring within the brain, right? And it impacts the wiring of the brain, and it means it activates the sort of reward system within our brain that tells us, oh wow, okay, I should be doing more of this. It releases dopamine, and it's really associated with that pleasure and motivation that then tells us, oh well, this is a good thing, let's keep doing it, right? Then there's also this tolerance and craving aspect of the brain wiring, whereby the more we have of something, the more we think we can tolerate, or we believe we can tolerate, because obviously the smaller amount of sugar or alcohol or drug is no longer giving us that same response that it did initially. So we have to increase the amounts that we have of that substance or item to get that same pleasurable feeling and motivation. Mm-hmm. And then there's the impact on the development of the brain. So it's not just that initial impact on the brain, it's the development of the brain, particularly when children are young. It's impacting if we factor in that children don't have a fully developed brain well into their 20s, I think it's 28 or something like that, then, you know, how are we creating addiction through initial substance use, including sugar and other, you know, chemicals, food coloring, etc.
Yeah, preservatives and additives.
Preservatives, additives,
Mm-hmm.
these fake sugars that the brain doesn't technically recognize as a sugar.
As well as non-sugar or
Exactly.
replacements. When they say something is a diet drink, are supposedly better for you.
Right.
Which again, without going off on tangent here, but the marketing side behind. I mean, I've got to be quite mindful about this because I work in advertising, so I see this day in, day out.
Right.
But it's even down to the colorways that are used when they're promoting or marketing a
product, food, or
i.e.
cereal.
Bar of chocolate or cereal, or energy bars, for example, and now especially you've got a lot of quite influenced. I think it's fair to say very influential people that bringing out sort of a lot of these sports drinks, but basically all it is sugar. Glucose and sugar
and chemicals
it's
not even just sugar sometimes.
No, it isn't.
Right?
Exactly.
There's some pretty nasty
Absolutely.
chemicals in there.
Yeah, there are. And that obviously is that's telling a story, and that is obviously very influential. They use various different influencers and whatnot to get the story across. As I just touched on, the colorways that you use, the blues, the pinks, and the oranges and the bright yellows. It's
why are they using those colors?
Well, because they show. I haven't got the list in front of me, but each color aspect. I'll give you an example. Blue is like a softer baby blue, like similar to what we've got here in front of us. Is used a lot within promotion of baby products, etc., because there's that association with the child. So red is generally used for anger or danger. That's why most the road signs and whatnot you will see a no entry sign is a big red stripe. So it's that kind of triggers the mindset into of arguably what you think is a positive response.
Right.
But really, it's a very clever marketing tool.
Green is environmental and
to act on your sub. There you go. Exactly. A lot of
eco-friendly.
And it's fair to say that a lot of these cereals. I mean, cereal really. I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'm going to put my cards on the table. I'm not completely up to speed with all of this. I've done my own due diligence, my own research for my own benefit.
Right.
So
you've read. You're not necessarily like the.
I'm no expert on this field.
But you've read enough about it.
But I know enough to know.
Opinion.
There you go. Exactly. The packaging is a very clever thing. They can dress a box of cereal up to look like it's doing you good. It's got organic, or it may not have the organic label on there, but it will have green flashes on there. Full of iron and niacin or whatever other additives that they're putting in there to and you think this is going to do me good. But then when you go and you break down all of that list of ingredients on the back and you see all the additives, the preservatives, the chemicals, they'll say it's low sugar. Yeah. But then when you go into it, you might see aspartame, something aspartame which is used in
maltodextrin.
Yeah, exactly.
All these others.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And obviously, and those that. And the sugar contents, even the granolas and what you think, great, these are really good, great start to the day. It's probably got about 20 grams of sugar in each serving.
Or full of rapeseed oil, or full of all these other oils that are terrible for the body. And we've been told for a long time are safe and fine, but actually aren't. No. And are wreaking havoc on our body in a number of different ways.
I mean, again, I don't want to go too far off tangent because today's topic is about addiction as opposed to, the negative side of food groups and whatnot. But it's absolutely prevalent to say it's
part of the conversation.
100% with regards to certainly, how things are interpreted or how they're, positioned within the marketplace to encourage people to buy them. Look at this. This is dressed in a way to show that it's exciting or it's good to be good for you. And if they're drinking it or he's having it, then it must be the way to go. And especially on the young, I don't want to
the young mindset. The young mind it has a severe impact.
Absolutely, children are strongly influenced by their, people that they look up to, sportsmen, and promoting all these energy drinks and what. Right. But so there is, there's a culture that's built up around that, and it's become a problem. Yeah. And you could argue that really the biggest kind of hidden
root cause
is diet. We're here talking about my journey with substance abuse, but it's a ticking time bomb. Right. These kids nowadays, are strongly addicted. They, as you say, they don't even are really aware of that they're actually the impact of
on them and broader society.
Exactly, because they don't. How many children will go into? I mean, I'm not saying this isn't a blanket approach.
Yeah.
I'm generalising. Of course, there are many out there that are very conscious about what they eat and drink. Even more so, to be fair, with what's happening now, it's becoming more prevalent that what is good and what's bad, and their education process is
there's more
awareness around
now
it. Exactly,
that we have to start to read labels
absolutely.
a bit more.
But it's still
it's hard.
Still very clever.
It's a moving target though, because we used to know what to look for. It used to be that you could just look for sugar, how much sugar's in there, and okay, if there's not a lot of sugar, that's fine. But now they've develop different words for sugar, right? So instead of sugar, it's now aspartame, maltodextrin, and God knows what other kind of fake sugars they put in. Instead of fat, you used to be able to just look at how much fat there was in something, right? And now it's like, partially hydrogenated oils. What is that? Well, it's basically man-made fat. That is actually worse for you than natural fats, arguably.
Well, there was an argument for both sides,
but if your body is not recognizing something normal and naturally found in nature, then arguably that it's also not processing it and digesting it. And what is that doing to your body? And basically the crux of the issue is we are exposing ourselves and our children from a very young age, when the brain is highly plastic and adaptable and moldable, to substances that create a dopamine response. And it is exposing children to a high amount of sugar and other forms of chemicals that are basically during a really critical period of their development, right? And it is connecting it with unhealthy behaviors and rewards that then exhibit in different forms later on in life, and are really hard to correct course on later on in life, because what we think is, it's just a little bit of exposure here, it's just a little bit of exposure there. But what we're not taking into account is that it's not you're not the only one responsible for your child's nutrition anymore. You send them to school at age 5 or 6, depending on the country, and it's now the school who's in charge of actually what they eat during the day. You no longer have control over that, and it's up to the school on a small budget, depending on the school, to then decide what they give the children every day. And that's 5 out of 7 days of the week, right? That's 5/7 of their life that is now predetermined for you. And you can have some degree of influence on which school you send them to, but you don't have much influence over what they serve your children at school. Unless you have a lot of money to send them to a school where there's a few schools that stick to a natural diet, but they're very few and far between. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if we can recognize in society that there is a broader issue with addiction that starts from childhood and diet, then we can start to get at the crux of the issues behind addiction. It's not just epigenetics. It's not just the wiring of the brain. It's also environmental and diet related.
Yeah.
And so thank you for taking our audience through that. I think it's an important topic, and we can.
Absolutely, we can always elaborate on that
we'll go in
a little
depth
bit further
when we talk about diet and nutrition.
Exactly, which we certainly intend to do. Because that has obviously been a very big part of my my journey through recovery. So. Yes. So absolutely,
and it has longer term impacts on people's behavior and neurological pathways, right? So that and parallels between sugar and substance addiction. So that's the crux of the issue.
There's that cross addiction as well. If you have, if you're the addict mind, if you're specifically wired in that way, and you have to be very mindful of other. I'm certainly, especially from a cancer perspective. Again, we won't go into too much detail, but there's strong links between sugar and cancer.
Yes.
So for me, when I when I was basically told, given that terminal diagnosis, it was pointed out to me very early on that sugar was the enemy, and to eliminate sugar from your diet completely, which is the very first thing that I did.
And just to clarify, again, not to denigrate our lovely doctors, but was that pointed out to you in the hospital by the doctors or by somebody else?
By somebody else.
Yeah. So it wasn't within the guidance of what you needed to be doing to heal. It was separate. No. Independently, you had people telling you eliminate sugar, but not within the hospital or medical profession, sadly.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's fair to say that, it's everything in moderation, or generally. majority of things in moderation are going to be okay. But you have to ask the question, if something has an addictive, tendency about it, or rather it has a substance within it that makes it addictive, I should say.
Yes.
Then you're going down a very dangerous path.
Yeah.
Because your mind starts to become, or rather the mental aspect thing comes into play, where you start to, as you rightly say, the dopamine kicks in, that dopamine wears off, and your body, you're missing something. You don't necessarily know straight away what that is.
No.
But you just feel that at the end of the day, it's just a fix.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's my stepchildren, my own children as well. They're all my children now, I should say. That's what it feels like anyway. They will eat 2 or 3 bars of chocolate a day quite easily.
That self-control is not there.
Exactly. And I think the education, as I touched on, is becoming more prevalent now. Now it's there. Exactly.
Yeah, more recently,
it is. If you look for it, it's there.
Yeah.
But the problem is a lot. The advertising arena is a lot bigger.
It's very powerful.
It's everywhere.
And it's very pervasive.
And the story that they tell is very, very clever.
Yeah, very compelling.
And I think that's something that we have to be very mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I see it within, my daughter's very young. And I see, I was very adamant for the first couple of years that she didn't have any sugar at all. And I am grateful that I stuck with it. It was very hard. I mean, everybody, even within my family, wanted to give her that cupcake or cake, and they ridiculed me because I didn't give her real ice cream. I gave her this, it was a concoction that I made at home of a banana and peanut butter. That's it. That was her. And then I froze it, and that was her ice cream. And my mother used to laugh and say, when she figures out what real ice cream is, she's going to be so angry that you've deceived her all that time, that was ice cream.
But I think as well, the palate comes into play.
Absolutely. But
because if you're on a high sugar diet, you have something that isn't so sweet.
Yes.
It's going to taste quite sour.
Yes.
But one thing I'll big note, and again, we'll come onto this in more detail when we talk about diet, but when I cut that sugar out, I went through withdrawal. And I know what that feels like.
Yes.
And I remember headaches, shakes.
Yes.
And I wasn't a sugar fiend. There was a point when in the early stages of treatment, during the cancer days, of treatment that is, I was eating quite unhealthy at the point, and I was having cakes and whatnot without the understanding. I didn't do my homework, so I didn't realise how bad sugar actually could be. But yeah, I think it's now, as I say, it's far more apparent of what sugar can do, but we just need to, just be mindful. So when I stopped sugar, after, as I say, I went through the withdrawal, which, as I said, I know what that feels like. So there was the headaches, there was shakes, and a few other bits and pieces going on. So once I'd gone through that, and I cut fruit out as well initially. Again, we'll come on to that, but. So I was literally hardly zero sugar going into my body for probably the space of about 6 to 8 months. And then I started to introduce some fruit back in because I wanted to get some of the antioxidant minerals, exactly. So I started to use some high oxidant, blueberries and goji berries and a few other bits and pieces back into the diet. Now, after not having those sugar rushes or those, having sugar on a daily basis or on a regular basis, everything just started, my palate changed, and a handful of blueberries was like eating sweets.
Yeah.
But then, as
we call it nature's candy in my
family.
We
go. Well, there you go. Exactly. And everything to me now, because I hardly have any sugar in my diet now. It's very difficult, and that's one thing is definitely worth saying is it's a minefield. Yeah. It's in everything.
Yeah.
You
have to have a stalwart desire to eliminate it, because it really is.
And what they say is low sugar. It's low sugar, like 10 grams.
Fake sugars. Yeah.
Or it's
filled with fake sugar, which is just as bad, if not worse.
Exactly. But as I say, so even just some food for thought, I guess, is that, no pun intended. But if you're weaning your child off sugar, yes, it's going to be a painful experience to start with, because they're going to be craving, they're going to be miserable, their behavioural issue, absolutely
act like an addict,
but then grabbing
at it,
so if you're
for it.
encouraging the fruit back into it as an alternative.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, initially, I noticed the same in my household.
Yeah.
You know, the boys, they, you know, I encourage them to it, but because it's
and other things
it's not sweet enough.
And other things, other things won't taste as good to them because their palate has been ruined. It's the same, you know, I now my daughter, I'm grateful that I stuck with it for 4.5, almost 5 years of really trying to be very limited, not entirely eliminating it, because I also recognize that if I'm too strict with her, she's going to go and do it behind my back, or the minute she goes to a party, she's just going to like binge because she's like, sugar. But I've stuck with it for the most part because I recognize now that when I do give it to her, or she has it through somebody else, she'll take 3 bites and she goes, oh, this is too sweet. And she'll put it down.
Yeah,
she'll say, Mommy, I'm full. I'm done with it. Because her palate hasn't been ruined by excessive exposure over a period of time to sugar. So she has not only the wherewithal and the palate to say, ooh, that really is that sweet, but also the self-control, which is the important mechanism to shut off and go, my body's had enough now. That's enough. And that's the key.
Absolutely, yeah.
Those are the key signs, that recognition of what is too sweet and the self-control to stop yourself from having more.
Yeah, but as you touched on a really good point there, because that was a very similar situation for me. Once I'd cut that sugar out for that sort of 6 to 8 month period, if I had anything with sugar in it, even a digestive biscuit was so sweet to me. It was, you could taste, literally all you could taste was sugar.
Yes.
So what does that tell you?
Yes.
That is, and now I will be honest. Now that because I'm having fruit quite regularly,
right?
And, you know, I'm quite mindful of what fruits I have.
Yes.
Again, we'll
we'll
elaborate further at a later date. Mm-hmm. But yeah. So now that my palate has kind of adjusted, I'm probably somewhere in the middle.
Right.
So I can, if I have a digestive biscuit, it's not so sweet.
Right.
But it just goes to show the power of sugar.
Yes.
It just goes to show how influential that actually is.
Yes, exactly. And that tolerance and craving aspect, right?
Exactly.
Of all addiction, which is once you build up a tolerance to something, you're going to crave more and more and more of it. 1 biscuit's not enough.
You're
going to want 2 or 3. 3 biscuits become not enough. You're going to want 5 or 6. So you have to be mindful of where your tolerance level is at. And if you're saying, well, actually, I can tolerate 5 glasses of alcohol or 3 hits of whatever and totally be fine, what does that say about your tolerance level? And what does that also say about your craving levels?
Exactly. Okay. Yeah, good point.
Great. So now that we've addressed that, let's go into, I just want to share a little bit about the impact of addiction on society. I think these statistics that are quite startling to me really tell a story in and of themselves, because I don't think people realize, again, generally speaking, I don't want to paint everybody with the same brush, but I don't think we realize on a collective level just how pervasive the various forms of addiction are and what the impact on society is. So if I may just read a few stats here. So globally, there are, as of the stats that I've read here, in 2018, there were 269 people worldwide that used drugs. 269 million people, which is about a 30% increase from 2009, so just under a decade earlier. And the growing trend indicates a really significant rise, right, in the substance use and disorders globally. Then there is also this stat that globally more than 107 million people suffer from alcohol use disorder, and 35 million people suffer from drug use disorders. That's according to the World Health Organization in 2021 stats. Now, if we move into the UK and alcohol addiction specifically, so that was on a global level. Now let's take it down to bring it to the UK specifically. And in the UK, 24% of adults consume alcohol in a way that poses a risk to their health. And 27% of men and 13% of women are classified as binge drinkers. The alcohol-related deaths in the UK, as of 2021, the UK recorded 9,641 alcohol-specific deaths, which was the highest number since the records began, and it represented an increase of 7.4% from the previous year that the Office for National Statistics did it, so in 2022. So these stats are as of 2022, so it was done for 2021 and then the year before that. And I think these paint a startling picture of the sort of rise in these addiction trends and the growing use of alcohol and dependency on it. And so, we can share later, or perhaps in the captions. I don't want to rattle off 10 different statistics that people will then get lost in. But, this applies to the opioid crisis that was huge in the US and is also, globally, which was pushed, by the way, by GPs, right? So the Sackler family paying GPs in the US to prescribe, people painkillers, opiates that then they became addicted on beyond their control. So let's not forget that. And then there, we could go into food addiction and obesity, sugar addiction, the mental health and, addiction related to that, like you mentioned, bulimia and anorexia. But I think what I'm trying to get at is there is ultimately a very significant economic cost of addiction on society writ large. And the global cost of substance abuse, they say, including illicit drugs, alcohol, and tobacco, is estimated to be about $1 trillion annually. So I realize I've just quoted some UK facts and now giving you a dollar number, but that's just what was recorded. And it's factoring in the healthcare costs that are related to that, and the lack of productivity that is related to that, and the law enforcement that then is required to deal with that, right? And this is by the last stat on the cost of substance abuse is from the World Economic Forum. So do what you will with that, but that's their statistic, their calculation. So I leave that there for us to sort of dwell on as we now go into AA and rehabilitation and what that's done for you. But I think it's important to set that context, because it's not just us. It's not just us as the individual dealing with alcoholism or substance abuse or sugar addiction. It's the whole society and the impact that our addiction has on people around us and society writ large.
Yeah. And I think it's worth maybe setting this up for a conversation for another day. But if you look at the way we talk about, as you've rightly touched on, because you hear those stats, the cost on society, or, as a whole for treatment or on the NHS, etc., etc. But there's still, alcohol is marketed to death. It's everywhere.
Yes.
It's smoking was banned.
Yes.
They used to, smoking used to be prevalent, not just across, the media channels, but also, it still comes under media channels, but, within Formula One racing, John Player Special was a big part of, showing me age now, but back in the 70s and whatnot, that was very prevalent, but they put a stop to that. But alcohol is celebrated, and it's seen as entertainment. It's seen as, you're someone if you're standing there with
status symbol sometimes, depending on which alcohol you drink.
Exactly, what you absolutely
depending on your poison, your upper class.
That's it. Oh, if you're exactly, if you want to be here, you should be drinking this. Or if you're a sportsman, then you have that.
Right.
So yeah, again, it's still
a lot of societal pressure and a lot of marketing directed at targeting.
So in one hand, there you can say, it's that cost in society, but on the other hand, they're pumping all of this money into advertisement to promote it.
Yes.
So
what is that saying about us?
Yeah,
exactly.
Do the math.
Yeah, exactly.
And we'll leave it at there.
We'll leave it at that.
For now.
Before we get brands knocking on our door telling us not to say anymore. Exactly. No, but it's absolutely, that is the crux of the issue, right? We have this dichotomy in society between, what is taboo in terms of our actions and how we respond, but then who's fueling that fire?
There you go. Exactly.
Who is creating that monster?
Yeah, and it's the strategy.
And who's buying into it, right?
Exactly.
Because we can't just blame the brands. Ultimately, we're the ones buying the brands, right?
Absolutely,
so we have a responsibility as consumers to be careful about what we consume.
Do your homework.
And where we put our money.
Absolutely, yeah.
And how that impacts our body and our children and the people around us. We have responsibility as, employees of brands to be very careful about and much more responsible, and not just ethical, but just responsible about how we target certain audiences and look ourselves in the mirror and say, actually, am I targeting an audience that I shouldn't be targeting? And what does that say about us as a brand, right? But it's not, it shouldn't just be about profit, but it is. It's always about the shareholders and the profit. And then there's responsibility as, people in government who should be regulating these things, but often, we stand to benefit from a little bit more lax regulation. So where's the onus?
Absolutely.
And the reality is we all have a bit of responsibility.
I think of this, who's
taking up that shield? Who's taking up that sword?
I agree, yeah. But I think, listen, keep it simple. It starts with you. They can advertise something, market it to death. They can sell it, dress it up, make it in fancy packaging. Believe me, I know that works. I'm within the industry, so
yes.
I'm quite mindful of that. But just look at what it do what it says on the tin. Yeah. Look at the product you're buying.
Yeah.
Don't just take it off the shelf. Listen
right.
to what you're being told and get on with it.
Right.
Just it's not complicated.
No. Turn the package over. Read the labels.
Read what's on it.
The
take that away.
If there are more than 5 ingredients, then it's
something
probably
to think
really,
about. Yeah.
really dodgy.
And take that product with you, research it.
Yeah.
See, I'm not saying you go and listen to, because there's obviously there's two sides of the media, and also there's a lot of good knowledge as well as.
There's a lot of conflicting information.
There's a lot of conflicting information, but
what was good yesterday is no longer good. What is considered healthy, last century or decade, or even just 5 years ago, is no longer. Soy was touted as this great milk alternative, and guess what? It gives people terrible
the estrogen levels, isn't it?
Estrogen level, exactly. So,
absolutely, but again, it's just
oils were considered fine, and now they're not. So it's hard to stay ahead of that.
Yeah, but
again,
a lot of that is to do with advertising and marketing.
Yes,
it's what we're being told. That's why I'm suggesting do your own. Look at things from the other side of the fence.
Yes,
do your own homework. Study the book. I talk to the kids and say, do you know what you're drinking? Well, no, not really.
No,
well, just go and research it a little bit.
Yeah,
just
just take one ingredient.
Yeah, there you go. Just take a couple of those preservatives or additives off the back and see what they truly do.
And the same
and what they're made from.
Yes, exactly. And the same, just one last point, and then we'll leave it at that and move on to the AA. It's not just the ingredients in food, right? It's also the ingredients in the broader arena of products. So just your shampoos.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is almost impossible.
Soaps and
it's almost
deodorants, toothpastes.
It's almost impossible today to find a shampoo on the shelf of the supermarket or pharmacy shelf that doesn't have phenoxyethanol in it, and yet phenoxyethanol is a known carcinogen. So,
explain what the cost. Yeah. I'm doing.
Carcinogen.
I'm on you now.
Sorry, suddenly I've become the interviewer.
I think it's worth elaborating on that.
So a carcinogen is something that induces cancer. So or causes or induces. Yeah. So if it's a known carcinogen, what are we doing putting it in every single one of our shampoos, save, bar 2 on the entire shelf? And what does that do to the consumer to have to turn over the back of every shampoo and, a 40 on a shelf and find the one that doesn't have that? That's a lot of work for the consumer to have to do. Anyway, so
exactly, as you say, just one final point, I guess, from my perspective anyway, is egg noodles.
Yeah.
Buy a packet of egg. What is in an egg noodle?
Good question.
If it's got 50 different ingredients on the back, you've got to seriously
not
ask
just
yourself
egg and
why. It's not egg and a noodle, is it?
Yeah, no.
We'll leave it at that.
Exactly. Great. Okay, so with that context now provided, let's talk about AA, because we've now kind of set the scene for what leads to addiction and some triggers that we have to watch out for. But let's talk about Alcoholics Anonymous. And I'd like to bring it back to your personal experience. Obviously, this is always from your view and your perspective. But what got you into the room? Simple as that. How did you get to AA? Because
I think that's once you start realizing or you have the understanding within you that things aren't right, you need to make a change. Then you start, as I touched on earlier, do your homework. Look yourself in the mirror and think, well, I need help. If you reach out and you type anything into Google about alcoholic, or type in the word alcoholic, help, etc., the first thing that's going to come up is AA, and understandably so.
Same for addiction broadly.
Curiously, yeah. Well, there you go. Yeah, I mean,
I'm just curious.
Well, I mean, there's spin-offs of alcohol. So it started off Alcoholics Anonymous, is now CA, which is Cocaine Anonymous, etc. So there's all different, groups set up for different substance or food abuse, or or lack of it, whatever it might be. Yeah. So it's been broken down a little bit. It's not so much generic anymore. There are, as I say, there's spin-offs of it. So to cater for those specific addictions. But from my own personal experience, obviously researching alcoholic recovery, AA is what comes to mind. And once I started to reach out and people around me, close to me, were aware that I wanted to get well, then they knew through their own homework, so to speak, that I needed to address that myself. I needed to come to the table and say there's a problem. Then they could start acting on that, which is what they did. And they started to reach out to people that they knew within addiction and how they got well. And that's when I was introduced to someone who's become a brother of mine. I love him to bits, my friend Mark, who, in inverted commas, became my sponsor. But he doesn't like to be called that. Because he just doesn't like the whole kind of scenario with regards to the sponsor thing. But he got me into the rooms. And I, first of all, the first thing I did, it's quite a step to do that. It's quite intimidating. And one thing I couldn't quite comprehend. I struggled to get my head around it when I got into that space. It took me a little while to do so, being honest with you. But once I got into that arena, walked through those doors, you're greeted literally with open arms. The first thing someone did was come up and hug me, and I was quite, a bit taken back. Now I hug everyone. that's me. But again, it brought that out of me. It was like, first of all, it was a bit like this feels a bit like a cult kind of thing going on, and there's a lot of talk about God and whatnot. But I didn't say I struggled with that, but it was new to me, so I had to process it, get my head around it, and then kind of accept it for what it is. And one thing that stuck with me, which is a common phrase that's used in the rooms, which I know that we've touched on before, but now we're on topic, is the similarities. They say, when you go into the rooms of AA, don't look for the differences. Look for the similarities. Between you and other people? Between you and the other. So what they advise you to do, it's not set in stone, but they say, come along and listen. If you really feel that you need to say something, stand up, put your hand up, say your name. You don't have to. But you don't have to. And in fact, as I say, I was advised. My sponsor said, just listen and listen to some of the stories. And what they do is they're not all of the same. They're different programs slightly, but it's still under the same umbrella. The fundamentals are the same. It's all from the big book. And I did exactly that, listened to some of the stories, and I could feel, not just hear, but I could feel within, their pain and how they got to where they were. And then you start to hear stories. They talk about obviously the negatives and the negative aspects of their addiction and what they do on a daily basis, the triggers. And what I mean by a trigger is something that might cause them to feel like picking up or taking or whatever it might be. Using. Yeah, exactly. So as I say, there was that. Of course, there's that negative aspect to begin with because it's telling the story. But then they start to move on to things like what happens when you start to become, part of sobriety. Once you start to when you become sober, and the miracles that start to take place. And first of all, also you're dismissive of it, but you kind of take it with a pinch of salt. It's like, okay, well, yeah, that's nice. But then they say, well, you'll be surprised how things start to turn around just purely by not drinking or not using. And that started to that resonated with me. And I could hear the similarities within the room. Similar story as to mine, albeit the dynamics were different, but the journey was much the same. You know, what the triggers were, how they started, the mindset, the overthinking, and honestly, the similarities it's mind blowing. And I was, crikey, you know, these guys know me. And then the bonds you could absolutely
on a deep level,
on a very deep level,
uncanny. The parallels were uncanny.
Yeah, the parallel, and it gets you become very emotional. Personally, I did anyhow. And then there are a lot that don't. There's a lot that obviously it's like anything in life that they don't get it, or there's too many barriers up. It's not, they don't feel comfortable at all in that environment, and they have to look at other areas. But as I say, it's generally the first port of call. It's common knowledge. AA is arguably the first place that you would consider if you want to get sober.
Okay.
Or if you go to CA, as I touched on, if it's a cocaine issue. Or again, there's different groups for different substances. But as I say, so I picked up on all those similarities. And then that started to give me the confidence to open up. And then once I started to share, and that was quite a big thing, the first time you do that and you have to stand up. And I didn't realise how difficult that was going to be. You know, you hear, or, you know, when you're addict and you start to get into the rooms and you sit there and you listen to the stories and they talk about step one and the fact that you have to meet your powerless over alcohol and that you're an addict.
Right.
But to actually say those words, I am an alcoholic.
Yeah.
When you say it for the first time, it's like, oh my word, hang on. I'm an alcoholic. And it's something...
almost like an out-of-body experience.
Yeah.
Like, is that me saying that? Do I actually feel that?
Absolutely. And it really hits home.
Did I just say that?
Yeah. It really... and that is... It's such a... I can't explain how powerful it is. And then the words started to flow. And I started to open up. And once I started to open up, then then that synergy was in the room. And all of a sudden, everyone... They became like family. And it was a big awakening for me. And as for the first, I stuck with AA religiously for like 2 or 3 days, two or three times a week, going along to the meetings.
For how long would you say?
I stuck with AA probably for 2 to 3 years.
Oh wow, okay.
Yeah, but it wasn't initially what it got me onto the road to recovery. But there was a lot more stuff going on that I needed to do work on for me to get well. But basically, I needed to change the dynamics of who I was or who I was pretending to be before I could get well, in a nutshell. But obviously, there's a lot more meat to put on the bones there. But as I say, it was that it gave me the way. Certainly the acceptance that I'm not on my own. There was a lot of very, very like-minded people in the room with different experiences, but a lot of synergy there with their journey, as I touched on. But yeah, so I found comfort with that for a good year. But then, and I say this is purely my own personal experience.
Right.
It ran its course. Now, I'm not saying I'll never go back, because I am a strong advocate and believer in it, and I'll be as I just touched on, in fact, more than once, that it's definitely, I believe it's one of the first ports to call, because their sound understanding, truly understanding of addiction.
And just to pause there for a second, you know, for those who aren't aware, AA, just to your point of how sound and proven their method is, it has its roots, it dates all the way back to 1935, as we discovered. You know, with Bill Wilson and Robert Smith founding it in Akron, Ohio, the United States. And the big book that you referred to earlier was written, I think, or published at least in 1939. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's when it was published, outlining AA's core principles, known as the 12 steps, that are now famous around the world. But those 12 steps are sort of built into the process that one has to go through when going through AA. So we can get onto that later, but just wanted to set that scene there, because like you said, it's a proven tried and true method, although one does have to ultimately find what works for them. You may not be ready to go through all those 12 steps, but they do work if you can. Is that essentially what you're saying? So I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I went through the 12 steps.
Okay.
So, I mean, this going through the 12 steps is quite, it really is quite something. It's
powerful.
Incredibly. I mean, there's, I mean, as I say, I've not been involved with it hands-on now for a few years. So I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what those steps are in exactly what all those 12 steps are. It's quite easy to, you've only got to type it in and you'll find what those 12 steps are. But one of the, a couple of them are certainly making amends.
Yes.
You have to, well, they say you have to, you don't have to do anything, but it's a strong suggestion that you go and you make good with those that you've hurt. And believe me, there will be a lot of people on the way, whether you realise it or not. You
have to make a list, don't you?
You have to make a list, and then you make amends, basically, in whatever way you deem fit to do so.
And you go back and have a conversation with them.
Yeah, go back and, you get honest, you own your part of that story, and and as I say, you do your best to make them in. You're not depends on how
they receive it.
Yeah, how they receive it, exactly, and how detrimental you've been towards them.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, and in some cases, what people do in blackout it's quite incredible, because you literally you just don't know.
Right.
You don't know what you're doing.
Well, and it's hard, but when you're dealing, it's one thing to have just offended somebody during a period of drunkenness. It's another thing to maybe have killed somebody, right? If you were drunk driving, and then have to go back to their family and apologize to them for killing their child or relative or whatever. The sort of severity of, or the intensity of making amends varies significantly depending on how grave the offence was.
Well, exactly, and it go anything down from your work colleagues or the person you're employed by. You may not have been turning up for work. You may have been detrimental. Whatever. Again, there's a multitude of different scenarios it could be, but there are certainly many cases. And I think it's fair. I think it's certainly fair for me to say that it's very common for majority of addicts to have to make amends in some way or other. If they're going to follow that program,
right?
So that 12-step program, which again is kind of strongly advised within the realms of AA,
right,
or CA or whatever you like to do. And I know I keep obviously because AA is my thing.
Yes, that's what you went through. That's what based on your alcohol addiction.
Well, and will continue to do so.
Yes.
And again, I think we'll make the point that you're always an addict. There's no cure for addiction. All you can do, you live with it. So you are sober for today, and that's another poignant point that they make within the rooms, is that you tell, because this is such a cunning illness. Well, is your mind will tell you are okay. Yeah, the devil on your shoulder will constantly say to you, "You're all right. You're over that now." Right. You never. So they strongly advise that you, as part of your repertoire, as part of your day-to-day practice, you wake up today and say, today I will be sober.
Wow.
You don't project onto what might be tomorrow or the following weeks. You don't say, I'll be sober in a year's time.
Right.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. Well, and that's a really important point, because there are many stories of those who, after 40 years of sobriety, picked up and started drinking or using again, right? And there are many stories of people who had, and for various reasons, right? Tragedy can hit and it just tips you over.
Triggers.
They get back to the triggers. So it's important to acknowledge that it is for today, not because you're trying to knock yourself down, but you have to recognize the battle is ever ongoing, and you're going to have to fight that every day of your life.
Exactly, because whatever way you look at it, even if, as which we'll come on to, is how I changed my way of life.
Yeah.
I had to make dramatic changes into how I lived, and I had to be honest and true to myself.
Right.
And I think from my perspective, that is paramount.
Yes.
And I truly believe, I'm going to go out on a limb here, I think that's one thing that every addict has to do.
Yes.
Is to get honest. And it's a big stickler in the rooms within AA. Honesty and gratitude are two incredibly incredibly powerful things. You do a gratitude list every morning. It's all part of the process of recovery.
Right.
It's one of them tools, as they call, create your toolbox, and you pull the tools out on a daily basis to keep you well. Which is, and I make gratitude, and again, as I say, I've changed. I've followed the spiritual way. That's what keeps me well. Simple as that, and my wife.
Yeah,
they're the two things that keep me well.
Yeah.
So basically, it's following the guidelines that they give you, but in the same breath, you have to find what truly works for you. It's got to tick the boxes with regards to what feeds your soul. You need to find something when going back to the kind of the AA scenario and why I did step back. I think I have to be honest here. I stepped away because it ran its journey with me, and I found that it become quite repetitive. It wasn't taking me to that next step, and this is only my personal experience, because there are those, and I'll say this now, that are completely dependent on AA in a good way. They have to go to a meeting 2 or 3 times a day to stay well. That's the power of addiction. Yeah. And good on them for doing so, because they know that is what works for them. Right. And that's what's paramount in my book. Right. You have to do what works for you. And AA was brilliant for me. Yes, that it got into the rooms and that put me on the path to sobriety. Okay. But that's not personally what got me well. Okay. It opened the doors and the channels and got me to meet the right people. As I said, that's where the magic started to happen. Sure. By being in the right room with the right people that have been there and done it and got the T-shirt. Right. And there's still those that are struggling, and there's still those that have been 40 years sober. Yes. As you touch on, that have to do the work every day. Right. Yeah. So.
And talk to me about, because we've talked about rock bottom between us. And so I want to talk about this, that ultimately everybody has a different threshold of what rock bottom is.
It's a very personal thing.
And you've talked about, you've mentioned to me that, it's often not until an addict reaches rock bottom that they actually get to the rooms of AA, or get to wanting to be in the rooms of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or whichever
into recovery,
forum
whichever format, yeah.
For you, it wasn't necessarily getting to rock bottom, because you had a different rock bottom than some. And so I'd like to talk about that. So you've talked about what got you into the room, and Mark White played a big role for you as your sponsor, though we won't tell him that he's your sponsor. But so everyone has this different threshold and of what their rock bottom is. But tell me what yours was, and how that played into ultimately where you are today.
Okay, so basically my first round of experience within the rooms of AA, as I said, that put me onto the road to recovery. I had what they call, I guess it's fair to say, and they put the pink cloud scenario, which is basically where you have a head full of AA, you talk the talk, but you're still not right inside. Something hadn't clicked. Something hadn't turned that light bulb on to say, right, this is what you're doing now is what is going to keep you well. Okay. That hadn't materialized yet for me. I was still struggling to be my true self. I was still playing a role. Even the AA, to a degree, was playing a role, albeit it opened the doors, as I say, it turned the light on, it made me realise I wasn't on my own, it showed me a way out, but it never took me to that next level. So that's why I say I just started to lose interest, but it wasn't starting to add, I can't underline this enough, from my perspective, it wasn't doing me any good anymore. I found that there's a lot of repetitiveness. I was ended up coming away from there, not feeling as if I'd gained anything. Right. And in fact, sometimes I felt like I'd taken a step back. That was purely my own experience. Right. I can't underline that enough, because they do so much good.
Did it keep you sober for those 2 years? Yeah. So let's talk about the impact.
Started to. So I was sober for about 3 months. Okay. And then I started to pick up again.
2 years of going to AA, you were sober the first 3 months, and that's it.
And then I started to pick up again. Yeah. Slowly, it began more and more. And then I was still going to AA because I felt I needed to.
Right.
But I was still picking up.
Yeah.
And then I went, basically then I was told you need to go into rehabilitation.
Okay.
And that was when I had my first bout of rehab.
Okay.
Which was a clinic in Marylebone Way, but it was more CBT based.
Okay.
So they didn't really talk.
CBT being cognitive behavioral therapy.
Exactly, behaviour therapy. It wasn't really reading from the book. So it wasn't AA based. So it wasn't talking about addiction as and managing substance abuse and the reasoning behind it. It's more to do with how to change the dynamics of your day in, day out activities to stop things like catastrophizing,
Overthinking.
which is, don't get me wrong, I think it's definitely a powerful tool in that aid of recovery.
Right.
It's certainly because of the addict mindset, as we talk, the wiring, the way that we're wired, we catastrophize predominantly everything.
Right.
We overthink everything.
Right.
We try to do too much at once, and we're people pleasing, and all of these different dynamics come into play, which make us arguably relatively irrational. So that's that kind of therapy, or that teaching, if you like, kind of gives you another tool for your toolbox.
Right.
To use
but
as an asset.
It's only one of many
but it's
that
only,
you need.
Yeah, but it didn't take away the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
Which was, for me, was that feeling inside of not being my true self, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I still felt uncomfortable within my own skin. I still felt I had to play a part. I was still talking the talk. I was preaching about the benefits of it, but inside, I was telling myself something different.
So talk to me about that first rehab then.
Yeah. So, as I say, so it was CBT based. There was, again, a real mixture.
CBT,
There's a real mixture of people within there. There was alcoholics. There was a lot to do bulimia and the other anorexia. There was a lot of patients in there for that. Bless them. Some really young girls. It was awful, an awful thing to see. God bless them. As well as gambling, et cetera, because again, it's all about the wiring of the mind.
Right. So many different types of addicts, and they're not just alcoholics.
And I learned a lot. And as I said, it gave me.
And where was it?
It was in Marylebone.
Okay. A well-known.
A well-known one.
Okay, we'll leave it at that.
We'll leave it at that. But yeah, for now, I don't really want to be
sure.
Because, as I say, I'm sure they've done a lot of good for others.
That's fine. No. Just to it's important to note. You could pay a lot of money and it still doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the crux of that issue, right?
100%.
So it's not. It's all about try, and if it doesn't work, doesn't mean it's never going to work.
No,
it's about
this
trying,
is it, and that's massively
again,
important.
Right?
It's finding what works for you.
Alcoholics Anonymous worked for the first 3 months, and then it didn't work anymore. Then the rehab, you went to rehab eventually after a couple of years, and that was helpful on some level, but it didn't really touch the nerve of what
it didn't tick all the boxes to keep me sober.
So how long were you in that first rehab for?
4 weeks.
And what happened after those 4 weeks?
I was drinking again. I came out as sober for 3 months, and then I started to pick up again.
Okay.
And then
what was the trigger at that point?
Do you know what? I think it was just a gradual progression. I think predominantly because I still didn't feel
yourself,
my true self,
or like you could be yourself.
Again, that there was something missing.
Yeah.
As there had been throughout the whole of my life.
Yeah.
Which is even more prevalent now. I didn't even really notice it at the time.
Wow.
But just the traits, the behaviours, typical addict behaviour.
And they didn't address that in the first rehab? I'm curious if there was nothing in that therapy that said, right, who are you, Adrian? And what does that mean? What is,
No,
who is Adrian?
Not really. No, there wasn't. It was, as I say, it was
all CBT.
All CBD based.
Okay, and so within
3 months,
3 months, you're drinking again, and then how did you get to the second rehab? Talk to me.
So
I'm only speeding along a little bit to make sure we get to that.
Of course. So well, as I say, so within 3 months I was drinking again, and then things started to spiral. I think because as we do as addicts, is that pour me another drink scenario. You know, oh, the world is against me. You know, what am I can't do nothing right. Everyone doesn't like me. You know, I feel a complete failure. I've tried this, it's not working. Really beating myself up over it. So the drinking escalated, and I just went from bad to worse. Marriage was starting to fall apart at that point, and I just found myself either in the pub or in the car drinking. And before I knew it, I was worse than before I went into rehab.
Wow.
So things, as I say, things went from bad to worse. Life had become completely unmanageable. I was drinking and taking the children to school. I was functioning. But I was constantly under the influence of.
Wow.
So
from morning till night.
Yeah, morning to night. I would take the kids to school. I would get up in the morning. Say get up. I hadn't been asleep really I'd be
Your
having
quality
convulsions.
of sleep is pretty
yeah,
bad
well,
too,
I was
as an alcoholic.
sweats,
Yeah.
convulsions, tremors, a terrible state. And the only way I could get over that, because I've been becoming completely alcohol dependent at this stage again,
Right.
was to have another drink.
Drink.
So I used to go to the local Tesco's around the corner. I had, at this point again, I hadn't had any money. My wife had cut me off from everything because she knew exactly what I was going to do.
Right.
And understandably so.
Right.
But
Rightfully
all
so,
that it didn't stop me from getting the poison I needed. That's, again, I know I've said this on more than one occasion, which goes to show the power of addiction is quite an incredible thing.
And how old were your children at this point, just to interject there?
They were at preschool, so there was probably around about
5.
Well, they went
4 or 5.
They went. Their preschool was from 2 till 11. So whatever, yeah. So
No, because then you have school from age 5.
yeah, but they
Oh, it was
so
only
they went
one.
private. So
Oh,
they,
I
so
got
they
you.
went.
Yeah.
So they went. Yeah. So
Okay.
from the age of 2 to 11. So
Okay, so
I think at this point there's probably about 7 or 8. I would say.
okay.
Because I was sober by the time they started senior school.
Okay.
So where was we?
So you had and you were drinking from morning till night. At
morning
this
to
point,
night. That's right.
And at this point, your marriage is disintegrating
Yeah.
because she has been very clear that she.
And I wasn't not supposed to say I was oblivious to it, but I didn't care.
Yeah.
And in
All
fact,
that mattered
in
was
fact,
the drink.
To say that I didn't care is probably too strong a word or too strong a set of words. It's more the fact that
You were in
the
control.
alcohol was more important.
You were out of control, and what controlled you was the alcohol.
Yeah. That was my drive, and that was all there was.
Yeah.
And I needed
You were
that
blindsided
fix,
by that
physically and
fix.
mentally. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. As I
Purely
say, so I'd
addicted.
get up, I would go down to the local supermarket and buy a bottle or steal a bottle of wine because I could,
Right.
as I said, I didn't have any access to funds. Neck that,
Wow.
then go back, get ready, and take the kids to school.
Wow.
Shocking.
Yeah.
I know, but
that's the
it's-
honest truth.
Yeah, but
right?
there's
Unless we
the
can get
honesty
honest
there.
about.
Absolutely,
And now you can.
we
talk
need to
about
get
it.
this out. We need to make, because I know that there'll be a lot of others out
Who
there
can relate and who have done it
that
and who
have-
are doing it.
that- yeah, exactly, and can certainly relate. And as I say, so that was, and I got arrested a couple of times. I was very, very fortunate that I was just given warnings and not allowed back in the store. So things were going, but I still wasn't rock bottom.
Right.
That still wasn't my rock bottom. And everyone's different. Everyone, some rock bottom might just be losing their job, God willing.
So what was your rock bottom?
My rock bottom was I'd had enough. And when I say I'd had enough, I felt that I was just a burden to everybody. I shouldn't be here anymore. In fact, it would be better if I wasn't. So I tried to take my own life. And I didn't just take a handful of pills. Let me correct myself on that one. I didn't go down that route. I didn't just take a handful of pills and go to hospital and get my stomach pumped or
try to slash your wrist and hope for that.
There you go.
It was
I guess the point I'm making here is it wasn't a cry for help.
It was a final. You wanted
I'd had enough.
You wanted it to be over.
And this is the insanity of it all, of setting the scene here. So it was winter's evening. The boys had football training, so there was 8 or 9. I remember now for the team they were playing for. Took them to football training, dropped them off, made the excuse I had to go. Now Ironically, I was stone cold sober at this moment because I wanted the clarity within to consciously do what I was doing. And what I did was I dropped the kids off. I'd already picked my spot, and I found this country lane. It's all coming back to me now.
Flashbacks.
So bear with me. And I pulled over. I assessed the bend, typical addict behaviour. Did the math, worked it all out. This is where I'm going to the exit point off the road. I pulled up, necked a small bottle of vodka, and did what I had to do. So basically, I took my seatbelt off because, again, I didn't want to come out the other side, and recover from this. I wanted to make sure that, and I actually, ironically, taking the belt off, I didn't know saved my life, but weirdly enough. But only in this, I wouldn't advise that to anyone. By the way, I'm just saying.
This is not a recommendation by any stretch of the imagination. This is absolutely just an account of what happened.
Would have it.
Yeah.
It's for doing so, it stopped what could have been. But anyhow, so I drove. I must have been doing about 50, 60. I swerved off the road, up the curb, down the little Trevor's side, because I'd picked a tree basically, and I aimed straight at this tree, and then I blacked out. I can't remember anything else. Next thing I know, I can remember hearing sirens, and I heard somebody say DOA, which basically means dead on arrival, because the car had swerved somehow or other. I aimed straight at the tree, but the car flipped, span round the tree, and then back onto the road, but it threw me through the side window of the driver's. Gosh. So my driver's side window threw me clear through that. It was closed, so through the glass and onto the road. Wow. And when they arrived at the scene, took
the pulse.
Yeah. Well, no, they just looked at me and said, "He's not survived that one."
Oh my gosh!
And then I remember them clearly.
But you're hearing it.
Yeah.
You're hearing DOA, so clearly you weren't dead.
Yeah, I was talking to them. because I remember I was in and out of consciousness. Yeah, and I remember them cutting my clothes off. And I said, "Oh, can you protect me downstairs?" Yeah. The things that come to mind. But yeah.
I've just tried to kill myself, but please protect my dignity.
And do you know what? Funny, that was my exact words.
Protect my dignity.
Please protect my dignity. So where the hell that came from, I don't know.
I have none for myself, but I have no respect. No. But wow.
There you go. Wow. But yeah, so obviously then they've realised, and the next thing they got me in the ambulance, and I ended up in hospital, and I broke my neck I broke my neck and my back in 3 places.
So you've attempted to take your life, in a pretty monumental way. You have thankfully not succeeded, and you're now in hospital. Talk to me about coming to in the hospital and, eventually being released at the hospital, and what guidance, if any, you were given either while in hospital and when leaving.
Okay. So, one thing that immediately comes to mind is they put me on morphine, which if they'd have checked my records
as an addict,
it probably wasn't on my records, to be fair. They may not have picked up on that, but arguably it should be. And in fact, I don't think there should be any argument about it. But I was pretty much high on morphine when I came round.
I mean, it's pretty fair to say that if you've just attempted your life and you had a breathalyzer, actually, that's an important point, right?
Yeah.
So at what point did you, at the point of accident or in hospital, have a breathalyzer to determine that you'd had an excess amount of alcohol? Well, because that would have been an indication to them.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, well, so that's the thing. As I kind of mentioned, I wasn't drunk. At the time
point of driving the car.
There you go.
Because you had just consumed the bottle.
I just consumed the bottle. So that's right. So at the scene, backtracking slightly here, but yeah, at the scene they did breathalyze me. I don't remember that part.
No.
But apparently they did, and it came up as negative.
Right.
But when I
But
got
that's
to
because
hospital,
the alcohol
it
hadn't taken
kicked
effect
in.
yet.
Yeah, exactly.
It was so
wasn't in
soon
my
after
bloodstream.
consuming it.
Literally,
Yeah.
seconds. So, so obviously when they get to hospital, part of the process, they took bloods, and it came up, and I think I was 3 times over the limit. So, which understandably so, if I just necked half a bottle of vodka.
Right.
But there was no effect on me at the time of the incident, ironically enough. But obviously,
But once you're in
kicked
hospital,
yeah. So,
and was there any discussion about
Nothing.
sort of what had happened? Any
not
counselling offered? Or?
Not until I was released. So obviously I was there for a week.
A week, okay.
Because as I say, I broke my neck and my back. So there was work, obviously, very mindful of that. Plus I had, which I've got a scar there, a permanent scar there now, which is a reminder every day of what I did. And obviously they had to deal with that, and
Head injury,
back injuries,
severe.
neck injury, etc. So as I say, I had that bit of rehabilitation, and then I was put in front of a counsellor, or rather a counsellor come and see me, I should say, and asked me about 10 questions, and then I was released.
So that's at the end of your stay you were put in place, before being
Yeah.
released.
Yeah.
You were it was a final assessment to deem.
And to be fair to them, I guess they're looking for certain answers. It's how you answer the questions that you're given, maybe is how they will respond. And I pretty much just said, yeah, I'm fine to everything, which I obviously wasn't, but that's the way it played out.
So it's a bit of a cursory, superficial level examination, and
I think
it's hard.
I felt like they were ticking boxes. It was so.
That was on a deep level.
Yeah.
How long was it? How long was the assessment?
20 minutes.
Oh goodness, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So so not ideal, and
not thorough.
No, I was referred to a counsellor, which I went to
upon exiting or later.
No, this was probably best part of about a month after the event, and albeit
by whom were you referred to? Referred by.
I think the hospital.
Okay, so they called you or contacted you a month later.
Yeah, and then I had this appointment at a local counselling office. You know what? I can't exactly remember where it was now.
That's okay.
But all I do know is that I think I was in there for about 15 minutes, and I was asked a few simple questions. One area that they seemed to concentrate on was the fact that I was, the word I'm looking for here, if you just randomly just go and do something spontaneous, impulsive or spontaneous. Yes. Exactly. So, and that was apparently quite a thing with regards to suicide. Is if you've got that tendency about you, then you could be depending on your mentality, your mental state, deemed to be, suicidal. So that was one area that they kind of stuck on, asking me a few questions around that. But predominantly, that was it. And once they'd answered those, covered that area, they let me go.
So there was no sort of acknowledgement isn't the right word. There was no sense or a sense of a need to address a pattern of a substance abuse or use. Were there any questions about whether you used alcohol?
No.
Were there any questions about your mental well-being beyond impulsivity?
No. Not really, no. Again, I've got to be completely honest about this. I'm not.
No. It's an important.
I'm not judging.
It's just these are just questions. It's not a judgment on the system, and there may well be reasons. Also, I do want to acknowledge the fact that while in hospital, you were in a very vulnerable state. Mm-hmm. So, one as a practitioner, a medical practitioner, you have to be careful about what kinds of questions you ask when somebody is in a very vulnerable state, because that can also be a trigger or a tipping point whereby if you were not in any way acknowledging that you were an alcoholic, to somehow suddenly ask you questions about being an alcoholic could be triggering somehow, right? Or could be, but certainly one would think that if you've just made a severe attempt on your life, a serious attempt on your life. Again, like you said, this was not a cry for help and hoping it wouldn't work. You very much wanted this to be your final sentence. Then there would be some level of responsibility given to making sure you soon after received the sufficient counseling you needed to get over those sentiments, because that's not a one-time deal. Usually people tend to reoffend, and particularly given that you had 3 children, right, and a wife to both look after and come home to and take care of, one would assume, this we want to make sure this guy survives, that you don't try to do this again. So to me, the duty of care is, let's make sure he gets access as quickly as possible to the resources he needs to make sure this doesn't happen again. And it doesn't sound like that was there.
Again, I'll have to be completely honest, and no, it wasn't. And I mean, you've got me thinking there a bit as well, because I mean, you can also think about how am I going to be with the children?
Right.
Are they safe?
And how are the children going to be?
How are they going to
they've experienced this with you, right?
Yeah.
I'm assuming they found out.
Well, they know now. I mean, I told them in their later year, I mean, they're 20,
Sure.
They'll be 21 in March.
But at the time, did they know what had happened?
They had no idea.
They just knew you were in hospital.
They just knew I was in hospital. In fact, not many people did, to be honest with you. But,
wow, interesting.
Okay. Yeah, parents, well, they knew. But
your wife would have known?
Yeah. But she came to me. She wasn't there. She never came to hospital.
Yeah. Well, she was taking care of the 3 kids.
Well, there you go. So, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, she had a reason.
In fairness. Sorry, not to be rude to you. Not saying you didn't deserve a visit.
I'm not saying you.
3 kids is, as a mother.
Yeah, I'm not being detrimental.
No, I know you weren't. But for the audience, I know you weren't being derogatory in any way. I just want to acknowledge that being, and also, one can't underestimate the task at hand, either for you to recover and get the support you needed, or for your wife to deal with that situation at the time, right? That's and making sure the kids were protected from you and what you just attempted to do, and knowing what that was all about. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, at any point were you offered counseling? No. At any point was she offered counseling, right? And guidance on how to handle the fact that her husband has just committed suicide and she now has to take care of 3 kids on her own, potentially with family support around, but effectively on her own, and recover from that? And at what point were your kids given counseling or suggested counseling to handle the fact that you two are inevitably going to be acting a little bit different now, given what just happened, what just transpired, right?
Yeah.
So I no blame on anyone.
Exactly.
Just
stating what
I think in an ideal world,
yeah.
in an ideal world, I think all 3 of those things would be offered. Yeah. And of course, we don't live in an ideal world. We don't live in utopia, sadly. But if we look at what people need in these moments, and we acknowledge that, okay, that takes money, but at least we can suggest resources that are available. They are, there are helplines out there that you can provide people at least access
100%.
to. You would have paid for that if you would, or your wife could have afforded to pay for that, perhaps to. Yeah. But if you don't realize that it's out there, you don't know that there's access to such things, then.
Exactly, and
so I think that's an important part.
Well, and the thing was, no, absolutely, and I think I wasn't well.
Right.
I still was.
And that's the crux of the issue.
Crikey, how do I best put this? But the attempt wasn't successful, so I never did what I intended to do, which would have, in my eyes, might take that pain away.
Yeah.
And as I said, because I felt like I was no use to anybody anymore, and my children would be better off if I wasn't there. And hindsight's, when I look back, I think it's quite incredible. But it is what it is, and I did what I did. But yeah, so you're right. There definitely wasn't the right support there. Let's put our cards on the table here now. It wasn't. Now right. In reflection,
right.
It most certainly wasn't. At the time, it probably didn't make much. And in fact, I'll be honest, I was quite dismissive.
I imagine, yeah.
It's like, I want to get home. I want to get me out of here. Yeah. And that's fine. Yeah, I'm all right.
Yeah.
But what about, do you have you still got suicidal tendencies? Do you still, no, I don't. I'm all right now. I'm fine.
Yeah.
And that was enough to get me out of the room.
Questions answered, yeah.
And that ticked the boxes, and that got me out of there. So judge that how best you feel fit, really.
Yeah.
But as I say, most importantly, I was still in, yeah. I think it's fair to say, if we're talking rock bottoms here, that was my rock bottom, because albeit that didn't get me sober, because I was still picking up after the event, not straight away, but certainly within, I do believe, a few weeks. But I wasn't anywhere near, in the depths of it as I was prior to the incident.
Sure.
But I was still picking up. I still had that empty feeling within inside. I still didn't know who I was. I still didn't feel well. I still felt that, as they call it, disease, that feeling of malady of the soul, whereas I just felt worthless. I just, the only difference is at this point was I had done something quite dramatic, and I was reflecting on that.
Right.
But as I say, I was still in the height of addiction. I still had the same feelings and emotions going on.
Yeah.
And I was still, albeit rock bottom, I wasn't swimming upwards as yet.
Right.
I hadn't hit that bottom and bounced back. I was dwelling down there with the rest of the bottom feeders.
Sorry, yeah.
So I was going to, so obviously I was still at that mindset. Mark come back into play, bless him. He sat down with my parents and said he needs to go away. He needs, and when I say go away, I mean he needs to go back into rehab, as like now,
as soon as possible.
And Mark pushed for that
straight after the
God
accident.
bless him, yeah. And that, I truly believe, is what saved my life.
And I'm
Mark
sure your wife was on board with it,
respect,
and your parents were on board with it.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'll be honest. At this stage, there was a lot going on behind the scenes that I weren't aware of, and I completely reason with it now. I didn't at the time, obviously, because I've been with my wife for 20 plus years, and I thought everything was going to be fine. Oh, I'll go into rehab and I'll come out of there and we'll carry on where we left off. It was already over. She filed for divorce when I was in rehab.
Right.
And I can't blame her in the slightest. And I've got, there was a lot of resentment.
Yes.
A hell of a lot. I let that go.
At the
time.
And
I've healed over that. And I've got nothing but sympathy and regret for the way that I treated her during that experience. So,
sure.
So,
which will have taken a lot, but it's good to hear you've.
Yeah,
because that would have
took me a long time.
A lot for you to deal with, but also a lot for her to deal with.
Yeah, I mean, your ego kicks in, and you think, you ask questions. Well, I'm not well. Is that
how can you leave me when I'm?
How? Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to get better now, and well, she'd made her mind up, and as I say, well, I understand. She's got the 3 children. Yes. She'd seen enough. They've seen enough.
Yes.
She'd been fighting this pretty much best part of 7 years.
Yeah.
How can you argue with that?
Right.
So that, obviously, as I say, so Mark got me back into rehab, and that's when things changed dramatically.
And this was a different rehab.
This was a completely different rehab. This was all AA, or
different
say
location,
all.
Different site.
Yeah, it was AA based. It's a place in Watford, or very near. No, it's actually in Watford. And I went in for 3 months, but as I say, it was AA. It was very much AA driven, or when I know I say AA, but I'm encompassing all of the addictions with abuses under that umbrella. But we'll stick with AA because it just obviously it
pertains to you and your experience.
There we go. So so they got me into these rooms. It was AA, predominantly AA based. There was the talk of, which AA is a lot around the God side of things, but God is expressed in to be, or they say, use the God term, not to say so much loosely, but create your own reality around God, if that makes sense. And what I mean by, so for example, they might say God is the great outdoors, so God. So so it's investing in a power that's bigger than you, because with addiction, or with an addict, it's all about me, the I am. It's all about, worries me, and it's all about me, and it's about looking at things from a different perspective and seeing something that's bigger than you, whatever that might be.
Right.
nature,
Right.
great outdoors, etc., etc. So it's finding something that's bigger than you.
And is that to get one out of a potential victim mentality? Because it's,
Yeah, it's
all
a
about
big
the
part of
id,
it.
the id, the ego, and the superego is all,
There we go. Yeah.
we're all kind of wired to focus on that. Some of the, but that can be, everything. It feels like everybody's conspiring against you, even though they're not. But that's part of the problem, right? Is you're constantly in this downward spiral of a victim mentality of poor me. So is that what it's focused? Is that the purpose? Okay,
absolutely.
Just
Yeah,
to understand.
it's definitely a big crux of it. I mean, there's
Okay.
obviously other elements that come into play,
Sure.
but that is arguably the foundation
So
of it.
faith brings you to faith or spirituality or religion brings you to sort of focus on something higher than yourself, bigger, grander than yourself. So it's taking the ego completely out of it.
Yeah.
And therefore you can focus on that and give you also a sense of not only a broader perspective, but a broader sense of purpose and focus of what we're all here for.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, again, it's getting away from the mindset of it's all about you. The world doesn't revolve around you, Adrian.
Right.
There's a bigger place out there.
Right.
It's to kind of open your eyes to something a bit different.
Sure.
So that's the kind of foundations of it. But they strip me bare. They take you back to nothing and build you up from the ground upwards. And it was hard initially, especially with the first 2 or 3 weeks. It was painful, and there was no letting up. You was in these rooms, you was having your practice, meditation. That's when I started to learn about meditation, which really, really resonated with me. I took that like a duck to water, straight in with that. In fact, I was really looking forward to getting up early in the morning to go and do that, to go and meditate before breakfast, and then again after breakfast. But there was counselling.
Had you ever meditated before?
No, not really. I had experienced. I wouldn't say never, but I could probably count on one hand over the course of my lifetime how many times I've investigated it. Right. And there would have been a point in my life where I'd have probably laughed at it. Exactly.
Yeah.
And look at me now.
Yeah.
But so
you're meditating.
Yeah, so meditating. There was a lot, and that's sort of that spiritual aspect. It's all more not to do with God as such, or however you would understand him, or God's source, or however you envisage that to be. But it's more to do with the way of life. What else is going on within the universe that is outside of your blinkered mindset. It opens up doorways to other ways of life, and taps into different things. And we talked about Hinduism. We spoke about obviously Buddhism. Yeah, we had a Buddhist speaker that came in and held a couple of classes, and that's something again that really, really resonated with me. And that's where I started to see the light. I started to feel a real strong connection inside that I'd never felt before. I felt that this is right for me. This is changing my whole perspective on certain things. And first of all, I couldn't quite understand what was going on. If that makes sense. I knew something was shifting,
yes,
but I wasn't quite aware of what it was actually doing. So, but I was really, as I say, I was really kind of getting into the practice. I was speaking with some of the counsellors there and saying how much I enjoyed this. So they encouraged that. They allowed me to step out some of the classes to go and do that. They encouraged it because it was self-healing.
Yes.
They showed me a few different meditational practices, which I started to invest in. And I started to feel well after the first 2 or 3 weeks. Once I started to get ahead and back in the game, in this game of AA, I should say, then a recovery, things started to shift. Things, all of a sudden, that light started to turn on, and I could see another way. I could see something different to everything that I've been perceiving and projecting in, what you could arguably call a previous life. But my life at that time. And I embraced it. And most of the work that I did within there had a spiritual aspect to it. And I It's a bit of a funny one because if I've seen anything that's kind of a spiritual aspect, whether it be some kind of ceremony or something going on, I've always took an interest in it. But then I've always pushed it away. The ego steps in and goes, "Oh, no, it's a load of jumby-numby nonsense and whatnot." You might hear,
woo-woo.
yeah. They took us to we had a day out, and we went to a it was crikey, one of the Beatles. I can't remember his name.
George
Harrison's old house, which he'd given over to
Buddhist.
No, it wasn't the Buddhist order. It was, I've got a mental block now. Oh, the Krishnas.
Oh yes, the Hare Krishnas.
So it was basically converted into a Krishna temple.
Right.
An absolutely amazing place.
Right.
And I remember clearly that when we walked in, we went into this big hall, which must have been at the time his reception. It was a monstrous mansion.
Wow.
His house.
Amazing.
As you can imagine,
Yes.
George Harrison's gaff. But
which when he died, he
left it to them. Yeah, he left it to them.
Yeah.
To the order. So, and there was a guy, obviously a student or a priest. I think it was a student, but he had his robes. He had the mala beads.
Yeah.
All of this.
I'm wearing mine for you today.
Yeah, there you go. Well done, you. And he was chanting. He was walking around. Had his malas in his hand. I didn't know what he was doing with them. Now I know that he was counting.
Right.
But he was chanting. I
Counting
didn't know
each
why.
bead.
Yeah, counting each bead, exactly.
It's almost like a rosary. You know, in Christianity we have the rosary beads. It's that similar idea that you kind of use each one to count and focus in the moment.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
But it's whether it be Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism,
Yeah.
etc., etc.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same philosophy. It's that same. It's three mysteries. Within Buddhism, it's called the three mysteries, which is mudra, mantra, and visualization. Those are and all three work together. But that's across, as you rightly touched on, within Christianity, it's got its own. So they're all different spins on it, but they're all. It's all in. It's the same. It's basically the same
Based
teachings,
on the same fundamentals.
but dressed up.
Yeah.
And it's that's where religion separates the spiritual aspect.
Right.
And they all dress it up for their own.
Right.
But you see where I'm coming from.
Yes.
So, and I remember watching him thinking, what on earth is he doing? What is all that about? Which, if only I knew. But, where it'd lead me. But, and again, all of that kind of resonated. There was a real, I felt like home. It was a strange experience. As soon as I walked into that, I connected
physically with it and mentally and spiritually.
Spiritually, especially. It just embraced me. That's how I embraced it. Actually embraced, and I felt it's like coming home.
Right.
And I just didn't want to go. And it was...
didn't want to leave, you mean?
I didn't want to leave, exactly. Sorry, yeah. So, anyway, so that was one experience. But, and then they did, as I said, we did a lot more spiritual work. And... I took that up, and that as I say, that resonated with me, and I spent the three months within there, and I was slowly. By the time I was ready to leave, I felt a change had been made. Something within me had shifted. In those
3 months, you had a monumental shift that allowed you to. The
spiritual aspect had kicked in, and I knew within me that this was my calling. Okay. There was something about it that was ticking the boxes inside to say that this is...
Speaking to you at a deep level.
There you go. Speaking to me on a deep level, telling me this is where you need to be.
This is where
that is what's going to keep yourself. You well. This is what exactly. That's what's going to find yourself.
This is where you will find. Quick interjection there, because that's a really powerful statement, and I'm tempted to end on that, but I don't want to, because there's a really a small missing piece here for me, which is, speaking of home, you're talking about this center that clearly had an aura that spoke to you, clearly had a feel, a vibe, an essence to it that spoke to you on a very deep level, perhaps on a primal level, perhaps on a level that spoke to your, if you believe in past lives.
I was going to say just that. Yeah, absolutely.
To a prior Adrian, or to whomever you were before you became Adrian. But speaking of home and feeling home, what was happening at home? Imagine your children were not allowed to visit you during this 3 months, or were you allowed visits?
Yeah, they come and saw me once.
Okay.
And
at what point? Because I know sometimes in rehab you're not allowed, because that can kind of tip you over sometimes. So
exactly.
At what point were they allowed to visit or advised to visit, and at what point did they come? Because that to me is an important element for you're going through this journey and what's happening to them at home.
Yeah, I would say probably about halfway through the the
experience,
the 3 month
the
experience.
rehab.
Yeah, the 3 month experience that they came along and saw me. But then after that I said that they've seen me now. They know Dad's getting better. They know Dad's on the right path, so to speak. So they don't really need to be coming back. I don't really need, I don't want to be seeing them again in this environment. I was seeing them when we're out. So
3 months is also a long time for young kids to be without their parents.
True.
So that's also what I mean. My daughter can't go a day without, So and yours arguably are older, so could have understood. But it's still hard, It's I imagine for them hard to have you gone for 3 months.
Yeah.
Hard on your wife to manage.
True.
That. Although if they know that you're just getting better, then that's that's important.
I mean, I think they were still quite young.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously they were still sort of about 10, 11, or a bit younger than that, so 9, 10. So obviously they're not old enough to truly understand
what's
the
happening,
full dynamics of what's gone on, and my mental state. And to be fair, I'll be honest with you, I think they were protected a little bit from that as well.
Sure.
There was some honesty around it, but in the same breath, you didn't have to be over honest, if you know what I mean. You didn't have to spill all the beans. So
I guess I'm asking because I can imagine in my context, or I'm imagining in my head a scenario that may completely be wrong, but where your wife might have explained, Daddy's gone away for a while, but it's not like a business trip where you can call and FaceTime them, or you can check in every once in a while. I mean, you're gone for 3 months, so even halfway through, a month and a half in, that's 6 weeks. So I'm just curious what was said to them and how you managed that, how you and your wife managed that.
Leanne, ex-wife, obviously. She, I don't know quite what was said behind closed doors, to be honest with you.
Sure.
Our relationship at that point had terminated, and again, as I say, I completely respect her judgment.
Yeah.
No resentment there whatsoever, but the lines have been drawn.
Yes.
There's a big mark in the sand, and
so
the conversation.
Do not contact.
It was pretty much that point. We never really spoke. We do now.
And do the kids know about the divorce at that point?
Infrequently, but we still do.
Sure.
But yeah, they must, again, I didn't really have a great deal of contact with them in the early stages.
Okay.
Don't get me wrong, I saw them.
Yes.
But
you needed to heal.
That's it. I needed to get well, or certainly be on that, continue that road to recovery, get stronger before I could start addressing certain things.
You need to focus on you before you could think about them. I do appreciate that, because that's a really important part.
Yeah, they'd seen enough. They'd seen a lot. They'd seen me at my worst.
They've been through that journey with you.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think we take children for granted a little bit. They know a little bit more than we really appreciate. They know a lot
more than we ever acknowledge.
Exactly.
And then we think, and actually they perceive, because I have a deep belief that they are more in tune with their feelings than we are.
I think you're right.
Because they don't have as many filters. They're not as, especially when that young. And so that's why I'm asking the question, because we talk about epigenetics and transcendence of, trauma, et cetera. And on some level, they will have experienced this with you.
Yeah.
On a deep level. And, your absence speaks volumes. Your presence speaks volumes. All of that will have touched them too. And I think it's a really important part when we talk about the impact of addiction. It's severe on you, but it's also severe on the people around you. So that's why I'm trying to bring it into conversation, not to blame you or shame you in any way, because you need to focus on you. When you're in rehab, you need to focus on yourself. And so there's definitely that recognition of, I cannot focus on somebody else properly until I learn how to love myself sufficiently.
Exactly.
So that's and to be able to do that, you need to really get to know yourself, who you are. But then there's there's this parallel life, parallel part of your life happening simultaneously, which is that you are a father of 3 children, and you had a wife who, yes, had decided to leave you, but will have been going through her own. So I just wanted to paint that picture there more fully. Rightly
so. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So so as I say, there was, but that gradually, the contact became more and more. I was still living initially at the family home.
Yeah.
And yeah, that kind of went on for about a month before that became unmanageable.
Sure. This is after rehab now.
Yeah, this is once I came out of rehab. Yeah, this is after the 3-month period. So I moved back in there, but then we decided that, well, the house was up for sale anyway, so it had to be sold because we were divorcing.
Right.
And so obviously that had to go. It was either that or she kept it, but financially that just wasn't viable.
Right.
But anyhow, so putting that to one side, so that was what was decided, and I decided to. Well, I was asked. My parents asked me to move back in with them, and I decided that for me to get well, I needed to step away from relying on others, and certainly my parents. I did not want to get back underneath my father's wing, God bless him. As much as he wanted to help me, they'd been through enough.
Yeah.
They'd seen enough.
Yeah.
And as easy as it would have been for me to just go and live back in their environment, I knew that I had to do something different. So I was very fortunate in that fact. A very good friend of mine offered me a place. He's got a flat over in a place called Berkhamsted, where he was living with his girlfriend. So he was basically said, "You'll go and use the flat. Away you go." So I went and did that for a couple of months while I kind of started to get myself back into everyday life.
Yeah.
Which is what I was obviously trying to do initially.
Build yourself back up.
Yeah, but yeah, which was definitely something that it had to be addressed, but I still hadn't embraced the spiritual aspect 100%, and things were still not 100%. And once you're out of that
safe environment,
that bubble, which is basically what they do call the rehab a bubble, because you're in that space, you're protected, you're surrounded by like-minded people.
Yeah.
You're back out in that big open world. I remember coming out of there, obviously 3 months of, pretty much in the day in, day out.
It's like a parallel universe almost.
Yeah, you walk outside and you see the cars going, but it's like a rabbit in the headlights. It's quite something.
Imagine how that was for you with rehab, but then people coming out of prison, right? It's like that's why a lot of them go back in, is because they can't deal with the change. Yeah, they don't know the world that's evolved around them so quickly. So so you came out of this bubble, and then what do you do?
And so I started to find thought I was starting to find my way again. Well, I was. I think I didn't pick up. So, meaning I didn't want to drink. I didn't at that stage. But again, I hadn't fully embraced the spiritual aspect at that time.
Okay.
So
meaning you hadn't created a ritual or a routine of continuous practice.
No,
to keep you on the straight and narrow.
Exactly. No, I started,
which is essential. So that routine is essential.
Yeah, I was meditating when I came out every day.
Okay.
I was doing a few little practices that we were taught when we were in there, but slowly but surely, as I started to get back into the way of life, if you like, they started to fall away again.
Fell away, yeah.
They fell away again. Now, I never picked up, but I still wasn't well.
Okay.
There was still something within that was not
niggling
quite
away.
Right. Albeit I'd made monstrous steps forwards. I was sober, but I was not embracing what I now realise and completely understand it was my calling. Which is the spiritual aspect. The spiritual way is what keeps me well. And I didn't embrace that fully.
So define the spiritual aspect, because you said you're still meditating, but what beyond that?
Well, I started
so
to...
prayer or...
Yeah, well, mainly meditation. Me now, obviously, I'm a Buddhist.
Okay.
So I follow the Buddhist practice.
Okay.
I'm a practicing Buddhist. So I do my... I meditate a lot, 2 or 3 hours a day. I do go attend and will continue to attend certain Buddhist ceremonies. I chant. I do my visualizations.
Okay.
I do certain types of service, helping others. My objective is to give back. That's why we're here today.
Yes.
That is my main agenda with all of this. But but at that stage,
you hadn't formed that.
I hadn't. I hadn't embraced it. I thought I
So
did what I needed to do.
Exposed to it in
I've
the
been exposed
rehab.
to it.
You
It resonated.
you felt something, a deep
Yeah,
connection, but
a
you
deep-
hadn't
but
formed
yeah,
the habits of the new Adrian.
no, not when I got out after a few weeks. I wouldn't say I didn't slip back into old behaviour by any means, but I was making changes. I was, when they say no finance or no romance for a year
Wow.
of
Rehab.
coming out of when you've been in the depths of things
Yeah.
like as I was at that stage.
Yeah.
You know, they strongly advise against those two things because they can just put you back into that chaotic
What do you mean
mind.
no finance? Because you have to make a living. So how
Well,
do you?
well, yeah, but you're advised to keep it very simple to start with.
Basic
You know,
rudimentary things of survival.
Maybe not getting into, if you're getting yourself into debt, or you've got loans and stuff to pay off, you've got to take out car loans.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. So where you're building up,
just go slow.
Something where it's going to be catastrophic to the mind, or arguably from an addict's perspective, it can create triggers. There we go. So they say keep it simple. Yeah, that's one of the mantras. Yeah, is keep it simple, stupid. Yeah. So basically that's what I was trying to do. But I did end up going. I got a job. But what I also did was, which I know dramatically helped me. I'm so pleased that I did go down that route, and I strongly advise anyone else to do so. I think it's actually good for the soul, for everyone, is to give a little service. And I did some. I worked at a place called The Passage for a year with the homeless, volunteering, which I did 2 days a week, as I say, religiously for the year. And they say, within the AA rooms and within recovery, about humility, about being humble, honesty, humility, and gratitude are the three key things to embrace. You get them three right, and you stick to them, and you make that part of your day in, day out, daily activity, or as part of your your remit moving forward. And when everything that you embrace, everything you do, you make that the forefront of your attitude towards everything, and that made everything. I don't know. Yeah, a little bit. It's difficult. It's difficult to put into words as such, but that humility. Yeah, it kind of keeps you more grounded.
Well, it puts things in perspective, doesn't it?
There you go.
I think again, it's back to that principle of focus on something other than yourself.
Yes.
And when you focus on other people, it has a very powerful way of, like I said, putting things in perspective, but to the point where you start to see other people's troubles. Yeah. And when you start to see other people's troubles and how they relate or don't relate to yours, right? Often don't relate because people have different issues, problems, and whatnot to deal with and contend with. And particularly when you're dealing with poverty or you start to appreciate what you have, or certainly what you had. And a better say, and then gratitude comes in.
Absolutely, and that is massive part
and it's a
of sobriety.
Huge part of sobriety, because when you can experience and really feel gratitude at a deep level, not in any trite way, in a deep level, with humility and honesty, then you start to appreciate the little things in life. Yep. I mean, you appreciate just having a glass of water and food on the table.
100%.
You appreciate having a table to eat on, right? If you lose your home, as you did, and you lose your wife and family, you start to appreciate what you had, that family that you had, and the fact that you had a network and a community around you, even if you might not have acknowledged it quite in that same way before. You had a community of people trying so hard to support you before, and then you start to realize other people don't have that. Yeah. Other alcoholics became alcoholics because they didn't have a network to fall on.
Absolutely.
Because they didn't have anybody to help with them, help with their rent when they lost their job. They didn't have anybody to turn to when they got sick, nobody to visit them, etc. So I think it's a very powerful experience to, again, see the problems that other people face and then put yours in perspective to those.
What you just said is absolutely spot on. From when you talk about gratitude and humility in the way that you just did regards to others and not focusing on yourself, because that is, I know we've gone over this a couple of times, but I can't emphasize it enough, really. It's that poor me scenario. We feel so sorry for ourselves, and the world revolves around us, and there's, oh, look at me, look at what I've gone through. Yes. And I remember in the past, one of the kind of things that, again, that really resonated with me when I gave service, I sat at a dinner table, or lunch, it was actually not dinner, but lunch, with 4 or 5 guys, 4 or 5 homeless guys. And what they do is they're given vouchers for, you know, if they go out and they sell magazines or whatever they might do some of the stuff, then they're given these food vouchers. So it's an incentive really to kind of get them back into, you know, the beginnings of society, if you like.
Yeah, they're not given money, but they're given vouchers to get food, which is
exactly. Or they're not just
survival
given
to
free.
sustain
They
themselves.
don't walk in off the street and go and get. They somebody have to work for it as such, but
it is an incentive to work for.
There's an incentive to kind of
work for the basic
say
survival.
You've earned something.
Yeah,
you know, you've achieved something, so you're getting rewarded.
Yes.
In a roundabout way. That's one way of putting it, I guess. But anyhow, so sitting at this table, and there's 4 or 5 of us around there, and everyone's got a different story. God bless them. And there's one guy sitting there, a youngish boy, and I remember he was the only one not eating. And one of the other guys turned to him. It's a bit of an older guy. You could say he'd been there for a little while.
Not eating because he didn't have a voucher, or not eating because you had to pay for it at this point?
No one really knew that this, apart from this one guy. He knew, because it must be quite a common thing that goes on. And so anyhow,
because you're at the homeless shelter. So I'm confused of where it is.
Yeah, this is at the Passage. This is the homeless. Yeah,
the homeless shelter.
The homeless. So it's in Victoria. It's basically a for rehabilitation for the homeless. So they got, it's places where they can stay, but also there's a rehabilitation process there. They can look for work.
Okay.
There's a section downstairs where they've got computers and that set up, and you can go in there and they can try and find jobs to get them off the street, to get them back into society, so to speak.
Okay.
But anyhow, so we were sitting there having dinner. This one guy wasn't eating, and all of a sudden this one guy just looked at him and said, "Have you not got any vouchers?" And he went, "I'm just not hungry." And he looked at him and said, "Are you hungry? Have you eaten today?" And he just said, "No, I've not eaten today." So he just passed his plate of food, and then this guy's got nothing.
Yeah.
And he just
he's homeless. He's homeless just like the other guy.
Just like the other guy. But because he knew how it goes, he understood the process.
Yeah.
And he knew what he was going through. I could get quite emotional on that.
Yeah.
But I mean, how powerful is that? And that knocked me to 6. And I just thought, you selfish son of a bitch, you know. And I thought, wow, how powerful is that? And that at that moment was when set me off. That was when that was a wake up for me.
Yeah.
And that when they talk in the rooms about the power of gratitude and the power of humility, and you know, it's not until you see it from another perspective like that, and that was real. That wasn't something
staged.
That wasn't staged. That
wasn't trying to show anybody
that
anything.
was someone's pure from the heart. And I don't, you know, pure love.
Yeah.
Absolute love. He had nothing. He's got, you know.
He won't go and eat for the rest of the day now because he's given his meal away.
Because he's given his meal away.
But he knew what that meant to that guy.
Well, he did because I gave him mine. But that's another story.
But see the power, the ripple effects.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
And you could share yours with him because he's now shared his with someone else.
And it's, you know, and that, as I say, that, you know, word of the day, it resonated with me.
Yeah.
Incredibly, and it did hit home, and the power of that, and that's why, you know, and obviously I'm there, you know, I'm volunteering, so I'm giving my time, my energy to them to help. But I'll be honest, when I first did it, it was thought, it's going to look good.
Yeah.
I'm doing that because I've been told it's going to feed my soul.
Yeah.
But I know it's going to look good on my CV. But Gordon Bennett, did it turn things around?
It taught you more than you, and it taught you more than you ever thought. Yeah.
And that inspired me to make, you know, and I thought there and then about making a difference.
Yeah.
And that was arguably one of the turning points for me.
Yeah. They say that there is no such thing as altruism, because ultimately giving in service of others actually does give you something back. And it's that gift of knowing you've done something good that is very powerful and stays with you for a long time. And so ultimately it's not altruistic because you don't do it just for the sake of others. When you get from something the heart, at a very deep level.
Absolutely.
If you do it for the right purpose.
And there's nothing, there's nothing more rewarding.
And I think it's a very I think it's beautiful, frankly, and we have to acknowledge that and share that, because there are many, many lessons in giving back and doing pro bono work and donating to charity and giving in service. So.
Absolutely. And taking the judgmental aspect out of everything as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Very powerful. Right. Well, we have covered a lot today, and I'm conscious that we're ending on a teary note, but a positive note. Whew, you got me. But yes, we've covered a lot today, and certainly we have much more to talk about. But I think if we can summarize in a sentence the power of attending AA, getting yourself to that first meeting, acknowledging that you have an addiction of whatever sort it is, and then getting to that point, pursuing a AA or any kind of fora that addresses an addiction, and then going through rehab, finding what works for you, the power in finding what works for you, and trying. If at first you don't succeed, try again, and then make sure that whatever you're doing is connecting with your true self, with who you are intrinsically at a deep level, not on a superficial level. That is so important, so that you, once you learn who you truly are and who you want to be, and what you connect with and what connects with you, you then have the ability to go forth with honesty, humility, and gratitude. And those are the essential secrets to life. It's not about being happy. It's about experiencing life with humility, honesty, and gratitude that then allows you to connect with a higher being and other people around you.
That's what brings the happiness.
And that is ultimately what brings you happiness.
True happiness.
True happiness. Sustainable happiness.
There we go.
Thank you.
You're more than welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.